Barry was a man of routines. He found comfort in the predictable cadence of his days. Work, gym, home, repeat. But tonight, something gnawed at him, pulling him out of his familiar cycle. It was a cold autumn evening, and Barry found himself inexplicably drawn to the edge of Dark Forest. Dark Forest was infamous in the small town of Millfield. Tales of disappearances, eerie sightings, and unexplained noises had been whispered for generations. Barry had never been one to believe in such nonsense. But tonight, the forest called to him. He hesitated at the tree line, the dense foliage ahead a stark contrast to the dimly lit street behind him. The rational part of his mind screamed to turn back, but curiosity pushed him forward. As he stepped into the forest, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Barry's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow path. He followed it, his breath visible in the cool night air. After a few minutes of walking, he stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, half hidden by overgrown ivy and shadows. Something about the cabin felt off. Barry's instincts urged him to leave, but he pressed on, the sense of unease mingling with his curiosity. He approached the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under his weight as he stepped onto the porch. The door was ajar, revealing the dim interior. Barry pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay hung heavy. The room was sparsely furnished, a table with a single chair, an old, moth-eaten rug, and a fireplace with charred remains of long-dead fires. As Barry's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he noticed something strange on the table. A series of photographs were scattered across its surface. He picked one up, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The photograph was of him, taken from behind, as he stood at the edge of the forest earlier that evening. A chill ran down his spine. He shuffled through the other photos, his anxiety mounting with each image. They were all of him, captured at various points along his walk to the cabin. Someone had been watching him, tracking his every move. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a faint rustling sound coming from behind the closed door at the far end of the room. Barry's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He turned it slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a small, dark room. His flashlight beam revealed a figure huddled in the corner. It was a man, disheveled and gaunt, with wild eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Who are you?" Barry demanded, his voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed towards a small, dusty window. Barry followed his gaze and saw a figure standing just outside the cabin, barely visible in the shadows. Panic surged through Barry. He turned back to the man, but he had vanished, leaving only the echo of his ragged breaths. Barry spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was no sign of the man. He rushed to the window, but the figure outside was gone too. Barry's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He needed to get out of there, to escape the suffocating darkness of the forest. He bolted out of the cabin, the night air cold against his skin. He sprinted back towards the path, but the forest seemed different now, more menacing. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Barry's footsteps echoed loudly in the silence as he ran, his flashlight flickering. He glanced back and saw shadows moving among the trees, following him. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself harder, desperate to escape. Finally, he broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the street. He looked back one last time, but the forest was still, the shadows gone. Barry's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he kept running until he reached the safety of his home. That night, Barry locked every door and window. The photographs from the cabin seared into his mind. He tried to convince himself it was all a nightmare, but deep down, he knew the truth. Something was watching him, lurking in the shadows of Dark Forest, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Peter had always found solace in the woods. The dark, dense forest behind his childhood home was a place of adventure and tranquility, a natural playground where he spent countless hours exploring as a boy. Now, as an adult, the forest had taken on a different character. It was a place of solitude, where he could escape the pressures of his high-stress job and the noise of the city. One autumn evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Peter decided to take a walk in the forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and a chill breeze rustled the leaves underfoot. He felt a sense of calm wash over him as he ventured deeper into the familiar woods. As Peter walked, he noticed something strange. The forest seemed unusually quiet. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie silence that seemed to deepen with each step. He tried to shake off the growing unease, blaming it on his tired mind. After about an hour, Peter realized he had wandered farther than usual. He decided it was time to head back, but as he turned around, he noticed something odd. The path he had been following was gone. The familiar trail had vanished, leaving him disoriented in a sea of trees that all looked the same. A creeping sense of dread settled in. Peter took out his phone to check the time and realized with a start that it was already past 8 p.m. The darkness was closing in fast. He tried using the flashlight on his phone to navigate, but the beam of light seemed weak and ineffective against the oppressive darkness of the forest. As he stumbled through the woods, Peter's anxiety grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his heart race. He tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Panic set in. He was lost, and the forest that once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. Peter walked for what felt like hours, calling out for help until his voice was hoarse. His flashlight battery was dying, casting weaker and weaker beams until it finally flickered out. In the pitch black, he could only rely on his sense of touch to guide him. Suddenly, Peter heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a whisper, faint and almost imperceptible, but undeniably human. He froze, straining to hear it again. The whisper came again, closer this time. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like his name. Peter, Peter. His pulse quickened as he scanned the darkness, but he saw nothing. The whispering continued, circling him, moving through the trees. It felt like someone was watching him, playing a cruel game. He shouted into the void, demanding to know who was there, but only the whispering answered. In a blind panic, Peter started running, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at his face and clothes. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the whispers. His foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, but he forced himself to get up and keep moving, limping now. As he stumbled forward, he saw a faint light ahead. Hope surged in his chest. He pushed himself towards it, bursting into a small clearing illuminated by the pale moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, but at this point, Peter didn't care. He needed shelter, and maybe a phone to call for help. He hobbled to the cabin and pushed open the creaking door. The inside was dark and musty, filled with the smell of decay. He fumbled around until he found an old oil lamp, miraculously with some fuel left. He lit it, casting a dim, flickering light around the room. The cabin was empty, just an old table and chair, and a dusty bed in the corner. Peter sank onto the bed, trying to catch his breath and calm his racing heart. He had just started to feel a semblance of safety when he heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was inside the cabin. Peter, Peter. He swung the lamp around, illuminating the corners of the room, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, coming from all around him. He stumbled back, knocking over the chair. The lamp flickered, threatening to go out. Peter's mind raced. Was he losing his sanity, or was something truly sinister at play? The whispering coalesced into a single, clear sentence that made his blood run cold. "Peter, you can't leave." His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the terrifying truth. He was not alone in the cabin. Peter's breath hitched in his throat, his eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The whispering voice, chilling and otherworldly, echoed in his ears. He backed into a corner, clutching the flickering lamp like a lifeline. The cabin, once a potential sanctuary, had transformed into a prison of shadows and eerie sounds. "Peter, you can't leave," the voice repeated, this time louder and more distinct. "Who's there?" Peter's voice trembled as he shouted into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" The whispering stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into a deathly silence. Peter's heart raced as he scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place, just the same old furniture and the oppressive shadows. He had to get out of there. He had to escape this nightmare. Gathering what little courage he had left, Peter decided to make a break for it. He moved towards the door, every step deliberate and cautious. As he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Peter jumped back, his grip on the lamp tightening until his knuckles turned white. "Peter," the voice was now directly behind him. He spun around, swinging the lamp wildly, its weak light casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. And then he saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her face gaunt, like she had been there for centuries. "Who are you?" Peter's voice was barely a whisper. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "You should never have come here, Peter. This forest doesn't let anyone leave." Peter's mind raced. "What do you mean? Why can't I leave?" "This place, it's cursed," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "Those who enter these woods are bound to it. I've been trapped here for decades, and now so are you." Peter shook his head, refusing to accept her words. "No, there has to be a way out. There has to be." The woman raised a bony finger, pointing to a small, ancient-looking book on the table. "The answers are in there. But be warned, knowing the truth might be worse than being lost." Desperation clawed at Peter as he grabbed the book and opened it. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols and archaic text. He could barely make sense of it, but one passage stood out. To leave the forest's dark embrace, a sacrifice must take one's place. A soul to bind, a price to pay, or in these woods you'll forever stay. Peter's heart sank as he realized the horrific truth. To escape, he would need to condemn another soul to this cursed place. He looked up at the woman, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Is there no other way?" he pleaded. She shook her head slowly. "I've tried everything. The forest demands its due." Peter's mind raced with conflicting emotions, desperation, guilt, and a gnawing sense of doom. He thought of his family, his friends, and the life he had left behind. Could he really condemn someone else to save himself? The woman's voice broke through his turmoil. "There is one other way, but it's risky. You can try to appease the forest spirits. Sometimes they show mercy." Peter's eyes widened. "How? What do I need to do?" "Find the oldest tree in the heart of the forest. Offer it something of great personal value, something irreplaceable. If the spirits accept, they might let you go." With no other options, Peter made his decision. He thanked the woman and left the cabin, the lamp flickering as he ventured back into the oppressive darkness. Every step was a struggle, the forest seeming to close in on him as he moved deeper into its heart. After what felt like hours, he found it, a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches stretching towards the sky. Peter approached it, feeling a strange sense of reverence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his most treasured possession, a locket containing a photo of his late mother. It was the last connection he had to her. With trembling hands, Peter placed the locket at the base of the tree and whispered a fervent prayer. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and creating an almost musical sound. For a moment, The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the oppressive darkness began to lift. The sounds of the forest returned, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals. Peter felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized the spirits had accepted his offering. With renewed hope, he turned and made his way back through the forest. The path seemed clearer now, as if the trees themselves were guiding him home. Finally, he emerged from the woods, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. Peter looked back one last time, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow in his heart. He had escaped, but he knew the forest would always be there, waiting. With a deep breath, he walked away, leaving the dark woods and its haunting whispers behind. As he reached the edge of his yard, Peter swore he heard one last whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you, Peter." But this time, it sounded almost free.